Welcome, everybody. My name's Chip Von Wisey. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Chicago studio. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you guys to John Syvertsen, who is one of our colleagues who teaches the professional practice course in Chicago. And it's particularly nice for me to have this opportunity because John doesn't talk about himself very much. So I had to go online to find a lot of this information, and then I had to fill in a little bit of the gaps by pulling it out of him at breakfast this morning. But it should become as no surprise to those of you, I see a lot of former students in the room who've had him, that there's a long list of things that John has achieved in his career. So on his LinkedIn page, he has a very brief summary, which is, I think, perfect summary of both some of his accomplishments, because it's a very small part of the accomplishments, and a window into his personality. 45 years leading firms in size from 3 to 1,000. Taught at 6 schools. Co-founder of the Open Hand Studio, and we're going to have to ask him what that is because I don't know what that is. The 2019 recipient of the AIA Chicago Lifetime Achievement Award. That's a big deal. Education, Georgetown University undergrad, Princeton MArch, Harvard Graduate School of Design Loeb Fellow. So he's kind of an uneducated guy. Teaching. So he mentioned 6 schools. Well, those 6 schools are the University of Illinois Chicago, where he taught studio, the Illinois Institute of Technology, home of Mies van der Rohe, where he taught professional practice, the University of Minnesota, where he taught studio, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where he taught studio, and the University of Washington, where he taught professional practice, in addition to 4 years as an adjunct professor teaching professional practice in Chicago for Virginia Tech. What John's known for in the Chicago community is really, architecture community, are really sort of 2 main roles. First of which, John was the president and CEO of OWP&P, which is a 350 firm practice in town, one of our better, larger Chicago firms, with a lot of work in all sorts of specialties, but in particular education. In 2008, that firm merged in with Canon Design, whereupon John went into senior management for Canon's international. That was this is, I assume, John, the 1,000 portion of your life, okay? So started out with a 3-person design boutique and ended his career as one of the, on the board of directors and as one of the executive committee managing 1,000 architects worldwide. A little bit of insight into professional practice, I think. Importantly for us, he's also a Chicago Architecture Center docent, which I think you're going to see the fruits of that experience in our lecture today. Importantly also, he was the AIA acting director in Chicago during COVID, 2020 and 2021. We lost our executive director for AIA Chicago through mysterious means. And John stepped into the breach during COVID and helped all of us get through. As far as we know here in Virginia Tech, though, all of the students who've had him in this room know what an incredibly talented teacher he is. And in acknowledgement of that, last year he received the Outstanding Lecture Course Award in 2023. And that summarizes basically what's most important to us here, which is John is a committed educator with a lot of empathy and knowledge that he shares with all of us on a daily basis. So I look forward to this lecture. John.
Can you hear me? Yes? That's good. Okay, so I have told my friends that I have known for years that I'm terrified. But I've also, in professional practice, mentioned that when you're in a situation like this where you're about to speak to a large group of people, something that my wife Ann taught me is that what you have to do is you have to take a deep breath. So I'm going to take a deep breath. That didn't help very much. But I'm really excited to be here. I've said to many of you, and certainly to Chip and my new colleagues, that Virginia Tech has always been a school that has been fascinating to me and amazing to me. This goes back 40 years to my early years working in Chicago, where I met students from Virginia Tech who were entering the field, and I marveled at their portfolios because I could tell that there was something embedded in these portfolios which was not just beautiful drawings, but some kind of thinking that's going on that's informing these. And so the foundation of thinking and drawing and building happens here, and Chip mentioned that I've taught at 6 different schools, but I have never seen anything like this, and this has been true for as long as I've known the school. So for me to arrive here in daylight, we got here basically at dark last night after driving across the almost entirely, the entire Northwest Territory. Arriving here this morning to see the school for the first time was a really true thrill. And you don't have all that many big thrills in your career. You have quite a few. I'll talk about another one in a little while, but this was a big thrill to see the school and to, as I said to my friends at lunch today, part of my mission here for these 2 days is to try to figure out what is the deal here? What makes this place so unusual? Why is it that it has sustained that kind of unusual and wonderful quality for all these years? So I'm not expecting to come away with an answer because nobody I've asked has known. But I'm going to do my best to find out, and hopefully in the future, as I continue to work with Chicago Studio, which I love, I will do that. So today's a walking tour. I'm taking you on a walking tour. This is a walking tour that the students that have been in Chicago with us have taken with me. Marcus and his gang have been there a couple of times. We've done this walking tour. Marcus actually added a new dimension to it, which I'm almost embarrassed to tell you, but I will when we get to that point. And so it is a tour of basically, as far as I'm concerned, the heart and soul of early architecture in Chicago. And it's called The Evolution of the Skyscraper. I didn't make up that name. I guess it was sort of obvious, but I learned this tour as a docent. I'm in the class of 2016, docent class of the Chicago Architecture Foundation. So what I've done over my time giving this tour is I've added some anecdotes of my own. And in a slide presentation, it's very easy to add even more information than we can give in a walking tour. So I'm going to get started, and I thought it would be a good idea to start with a piece of music. If I can get the cursor over there. Oh, there we go. That music is the very opening of Antonin Dvorak's Ninth Symphony, which is called From the New World, and it was written in 1893. It's an important piece of music because I think it does kind of capture what I think is more or less the heart and soul of this moment in time in Chicago, which I'll get to in a minute. But I also have a reading I want to share with you. This is Hamlin Garland in his book called A Son of the Middle Border, describing the experience of a young person arriving in Chicago for the first time at about this same period of time, around the turn of the century. With all my pay in my pocket and my trunk checked, I took the train for Chicago. I shall never forget the feeling of dismay with which, an hour later, I perceived from the car window a huge smoke cloud which embraced the whole eastern horizon. For this, I was told, was the soaring banner of the great and gloomy inland metropolis, whose dens of vice and houses of greed had been so often reported to me by wandering hired men. It is in truth only a huge, flimsy country town in those days, but to me it was august as well as terrible. Up to this moment, Rockford was the largest town I had ever seen, and the mere thought of 1 million people stunned my imagination. How can so many people find a living in one place? Naturally, I believed most of them to be robbers. If the city is miles across, how am I to get from the railway station to my hotel without being assaulted? Had it not been for the fear of ridicule, I think I should have turned back at the next stop. The shining lands beyond seemed hardly worth a struggle against the dragon's brood with which the dreadful city was aswarm. Nevertheless, I kept my seat and was carried swiftly on. Soon the straggling farmhouses thickened into groups. The villages merged into suburban towns, and the train began to clatter through sooty freight yards filled with boxcars and switching engines. At last, after crawling through tangled, thickening webs of steel, it plunged into a huge, dark, and noisy shed and came to a halt, and a few minutes later, I faced the hackmen of Chicago. I, as verdant a youth as these experienced pirates had ever made common cause against. All the afternoon and evening, we wandered about the streets, being very careful not to go too far from our hotel, counting the stories of the tall buildings and absorbing the drama of the pavement. Everything interested us. The business section, so sordid to others, was grandly terrifying to us. The self-absorption of the men, the calm glances of the women, humbled our simple souls. Nothing was commonplace. Nothing was ugly to us. So I want to focus on that sort of nugget of time, that time where so many things were happening in Chicago around the turn of the century. But let me set the stage first. In roughly, maybe 1673 until 1675, Marquette and Joliet began an exploration trying to find a water route from the East Coast, basically, to the upper Great Lakes. And on their journey, which began in St. Ignace in upper Michigan, they went through Wisconsin, down the Mississippi River as far as Arkansas and Missouri, came back up the Mississippi, across Illinois, and made their way to what is today the mouth of the Chicago River. They had to portage the last 94 miles, and so they knew that there really wasn't a water route yet. Fast forward to 1783. On the right side, you see a map of the United States that shows the results of the Treaty of Paris, which actually ended the Revolutionary War. And that is what defined the first phase of American development. The red on the right is that stretch. But then in 1787, just a few years later, the Northwest Ordinance was passed, and that basically set the rules of development for land north and west of the Ohio River. And as I think I said yesterday, I drove through most of that on my way here from Chicago. So the Northwest Ordinance, 1787, the land northwest of the Ohio River, and it is about this time that a Haitian African fur trapper named Jean Pointe de Sable settled at the swampy mouth of the Chicago River. And so that is really the beginning of the development of Chicago. He is considered our first Chicago settler. In 1803, we had the Louisiana Purchase, and in 1804, the building of Fort Dearborn, which was basically built at the juncture of Michigan Avenue in Chicago and the Chicago River. And this is where the fort was built in order to protect against anyone who would try to attack this new land of American development. So it was basically fairly close to this juncture between the Northwest Territories and the Louisiana Purchase. And as you can see in this slide, it's sort of the next slide, you see this sort of interesting mouth of beach, sand, and gravel, and of course it's not Lake Michigan, in this case it's Michigan Lake. They realized that they had to improve the mouth of the Chicago River, and so some dredging began. It was basically unnavigable because it was so thick with both swampy land but also clay underneath the soil. So in 1833, which you see here, Chicago had blossomed to the robust size of 350 people. Here you see a plan of the city from that time. Wolf Tavern, which you see in the image in the center of the screen, is actually where Wolf Point is in Chicago today. So some of these pieces actually remain in place. But the point is that it was beginning to grow in the 1830s. It was starting to become a place of important commerce because of its presence near the river. The idea is that you could, through Lake Michigan, get timber from both Michigan and Wisconsin into the Chicago area, and then from there were different ways to distribute the material for construction, either to the west, which was starting to develop, or back to the east, but very slow transport. Until, well, in 1825, the Erie Canal was completed, and that made the connection from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. But it was a number of years later, between 1836 and 1848, that the Illinois and Michigan Canal was completed, and the I&M Canal is what made it possible to finally connect by water Lake Michigan to the Illinois River and onward to the Mississippi River. So that was a very big, important development, and importantly, this is when Chicago really started to grow. You had the Irish, the German, the East European immigrants flocking to Chicago to work on the canal. And I should point out, by the way, about halfway along the canal is a very, very important town. It's important because it's the birthplace of Anne, my wife, who is sitting right there, Seneca, Illinois, along that canal between Lake Michigan and the Illinois River. So just about the time the canal was complete, and as it was beginning to work as a transport for timber especially, the railroads came through. The railroad was really an important addition. You can see this incredibly dense sort of lacing of railroad tracks, especially in the Midwest and the East. It was timber from the north, but now it was possible to get beef cattle and hogs from the west into Chicago. The refrigerated car had been invented, so it was possible to transport beef and pork to the East Coast and to other points from Chicago. A big change. So if in 1850 the population of Chicago was roughly 30,000 people, 20 years later, in 1871, the population had grown to 300,000 people. And on that fateful day of October 8th, 1871, the city burned, the Great Chicago Fire. And you can see up in the left, I don't know if my cursor actually shows where I am. No, this is just not working. Upper left is where the fire started. It was Mrs. O'Leary's barn where the fire started. And as some of you know, Mrs. O'Leary's cow was blamed for kicking over a lantern that started the fire. But importantly, I think it was probably 10 years ago, the Chicago City Council, in their wisdom, passed an official ordinance exonerating the cow. So the cow is no longer the official cause of the Chicago fire. I guess we just keep blaming it on Mrs. O'Leary. But the wind was blowing from left to right, from the southwest to the northeast, blowing very hard, knocked down or destroyed 17,000 buildings, burned roughly 2,000 acres, burned from roughly 12 blocks south of the center of today's downtown all the way up to Fullerton Avenue, which is about 2 miles north of downtown, including the destruction of 73 miles of streets. So essentially, all of the commercial and residential part of the city was destroyed by the fire. Of 300,000 people, 100,000 lost their homes, and roughly 250 people lost their lives. If there was a silver lining, it was the fact that the industry to the south was spared. The fire started a ways south, but south of where the fire started were the stockyards, the rail yards, and so there was hope for the rebuilding of Chicago. The financial engine was not destroyed, but people were displaced. And this is a view of the city at the time of the Chicago fire. There are many, many, many pictures that show the pretty amazing desolation. Investment dollars began to pour in, along with speculators, largely from Boston and New York. So here's where I'd like to start our tour. It's called The Evolution of the Skyscraper. We're going to weave innovations and world events. The innovations are building technologies, materials, construction methods, and the world events are the fire, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and Vietnam. It is an important part of the story. This is true in any city that you live in. that these world events do affect the way things evolve or don't evolve during a period of time in a city. And as you're reading a city, it's worth it to know that sometimes there are pauses in the action. There are things that are distractions from the ability for business as usual to occur. And it's at those periods of time that in many cases there's a quiet sort of exploration of new technologies. So people continue to ask what is possible, and that the answer to that question changes rather dramatically, especially in this story about Chicago. But what happened right after the fire? Well, the Berghof was a very important building built immediately after the fire. The Berghof, designed by Charles Palmer and completed literally the year after the fire in 1872, is a very famous restaurant in Chicago to this day. But it's a good example of not only what was built immediately after the fire, but it's a good example of what was built before the fire as well. Many buildings in Chicago. I'm focusing here on the west portion of the building. You can see it has a cast iron facade, sort of an Italianate design with load-bearing masonry walls on the sides and the back, and the structure on the interior is heavy timber. The building is 4 floors, but you have to walk to the 4th floor because even though Otis had already invented the safety elevator, elevators were not electrified. They were sometimes run by steam or sometimes by pulleys and ropes. And so the cheap floors were on the top, and the more expensive floors where the retail was were closer to the bottom because you didn't have to walk up the steps. What we've learned from the Chicago fire is that cast iron actually fails at about 300 degrees. And one description of the fire says, the melting iron was flowing through the streets like butter. So remember, we had swampy land. The river was almost unnavigable at the beginning, and that swampy land was rich in clay. And so a new requirement that came into existence shortly after the fire was that the structural members of new buildings would be encased in baked clay or terracotta. And that became the first sort of effort to fireproofing, obviously to allow for the rebuilding of the center of the city, but to do so more safely. So, you know, this is just another picture from that era. This is a picture of State Street, which at the time was one of the busiest streets in the world, and I suppose this was the city that Hamlin Garland arrived at on the train station. The next building, a wonderful building, the Rookery, was designed by Burnham and Root, completed in 1888, and in a really strange juxtaposition, the lobbies and the light court were completely renovated by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1906. One of the most unusual redesigns of an existing space, probably in Chicago, maybe anywhere. So the Rookery is quite a spectacular building. Its exterior is heavy granite masonry. This is a load-bearing wall on 2 major facades of the building. And you can't really see too well here, but in this building on the ground floor especially, there are a couple of the first 2 floors, the use of rusticated granite, so beautiful chunks of granite, rusticated stone, sort of a smooth granite, and then even a polished granite. So almost everything that you can do with granite is done in this facade, in the 2 major facades of this building. This is the entrance, and here again you see the rusticated carved granite with terracotta as well in brick above. Remember, this is Burnham and Root, Daniel Burnham and John Wellborn Root. Daniel Burnham gave us the plan of Chicago, but also gave us the plan for the World's Columbian Exposition. And John Wellborn Root was a designer, and they were a good partnership. But remember this image a couple of minutes from now when I show you a picture of another building designed by the same 2 people. But here is, for me, I'm going to just say it. Marcus, I'm going to say it. This is the most important place in Chicago. You can go to other places, but if you want to study architecture in Chicago, you have to go here. And if you don't know where this is, call me and I'll take you there. And then you have to put your hand on it, because this is one of the 2 side elevations of the Rookery. And this is the place where the old meets the new. This is the place where the heavy rusticated stone is immediately adjacent to a beautiful early version of an industrial metal curtain wall. So you've got masonry bearing wall, and then you've got this steel metal frame in the building with this facade attached to it that's performing only the function of enclosure, not the function of support. And you've got maybe the first hint of the skeleton frame. And I just think, this is my favorite street in Chicago. It's actually more of an alley now. So after I touch that place where those two things come together, then I walk down that street and it takes me back to the Federal Center. So I think Marcus and his students had a particularly meaningful interaction with that particular condition. But this is the atrium of that space, spectacular space, but it's as renovated by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1907. And so you see sort of a vestige of the original building in the cast iron oriel staircase that winds upward through the building. Another spectacular view of this space looking at some of Frank Lloyd Wright's ornamental light fixtures suspended from this white painted framework in the building. But sometimes I wonder, what was this like before Frank Lloyd Wright came to town and was hired? And so there is this little place where it is revealed. This is a place where the original cast iron, steel, metal framework of the entire structure was revealed. And I know it's heresy, but sometimes I just wonder, what would it be like if the whole space were the way it was originally? So that's me saying, maybe we should take away the Frank Lloyd Wright part. I just want you to know that nobody in Chicago agrees with me, so don't worry, it's not going to happen. But I still kind of wonder. As you move up into the building, you can see, looking down on that atrium space, you can see the suggestion of a framework. You can see the horizontal bands of the floors. You can also see the vertical elements. And then on the right side, this beautiful staircase, which moves through the building and is surrounded and closed with the, I guess you'd call it a curtain wall, but that is the view of the staircase on a typical floor. Just a very, very beautiful, beautiful piece of design in that building. But now we're going to jump to the Monadnock building, and I guess I have to say this is probably, if that joint between the old and the new and Rookery is my favorite place, this has got to be my favorite building. Designed also by Burnham and Root, completed in 1891, with an addition by Halliburton Roche just a couple of years later in 1893. Originally, again, designed by Daniel Burnham and John Wellborn Root, the developers for this building were a pair of brothers called the Brooks Brothers, no relationship to the clothing manufacturer, but their representative for the project was a man named Owen Aldis, and Owen Aldis was their person in Chicago in charge of the project. This is an early scheme for that building, and you can just see what we'll see in a couple of other buildings, this kind of wrestling match regarding style. Here is a new building type. Don't you have to have classical columns and capitals on it, even though they're not doing anything? It's purely decorative, and even though the proportion has nothing to do with anything that you've ever seen in Rome or Athens, but you got to have something. And so here it is, the beautiful or not so beautiful capitals marching across the top. But one of the things that's sort of interesting to me is at the very top of the building, you see just a very gentle curve, almost maybe reminiscent of something you might see in an Egyptian building or Egyptian volume, although they didn't know about that at that time. But this scheme was junked, and it was junked, I think, for two reasons. One, because I don't think that John Wellborn Root actually did it. I think that one of his people in the office did it while he was out of town, and he came back and said, no, we can't do that. And the others at the Brooks Brothers probably said, it's too expensive, we have to strip it down. Doesn't really matter. This is the end result. And here you see the Monadnock building. Exterior walls are load-bearing, and this is the tallest at 16 stories. And you can check me on this, do some research, see if I'm wrong. This is the tallest load-bearing brick building ever built. Ever. Does anyone know a taller one? Okay, you can still do the research, and brick is important because it's not, maybe there's a taller stone one. The tallest load-bearing brick building ever built, and I'll explain to you why that's the case, why you would never do such a thing again. And I think the main reason is that on the ground floor, the walls are 6 feet thick. So the footings for this building are a grillage of railroad tracks encased in concrete, but the design goal of John Wellborn Root was to find an architecture that was uniquely American. And so he had this idea of repose. So seemingly the building is void of ornament, and yet I'd say that there are probably a few maybe integral ornamental aspects that are really important in the building that contribute to its beauty. One is this curved cornice that you see at the top of the building, and I have other pictures of that. The other is the wave-like projection of the bays that poke out from the facade of the building. And then perhaps you could argue that even the color of the brick itself is an aesthetic decision that is almost like ornament, totally integrated. But I think importantly for this building, there are two technologies that come into play that certainly contribute. Oh, this by the way, I wanted to mention, I show this picture. One of the reasons why these buildings were starting to become vertical is that while you had the stockyards and rail yards on the south side, it used to be that the attorneys and the accountants and so forth stayed at the factory and worked at the factory, but there was a big movement of white-collar workers into the city. So now you had all of the accountants and attorneys and other service support people moving away from the factories and the stockyards back into the city itself. And so there was that pressure to expand vertically. But the two technologies that came along, one, yes, we had the safety elevator, and here's a picture, a little bit hazy, but on the right side you see the diagram that shows how the safety elevator works. Basically, it means that when the cable snaps, which almost never happens, but it does happen, there are catches that are activated, and that prevents the elevator from falling. On the left side, you see Otis actually demonstrating this at a fair somewhere. You know, you can imagine people being shocked as they cut the cord and they think he's going to plunge to his at least serious injury, but the safety catches catch in. But the difference between then and now is that with Monadnock, the buildings, the elevators were electrified, which meant that now we can have electric elevators. That means that the expensive floors are at the top, because at the top of the building, you can be in a state of repose because you are elevated above the commotion of the street. The other major invention that made the building possible was the invention of hydraulically pressed brick. Basically, if you take brick as it is and you squeeze more moisture out of it, you make it more dense and make it possible to stack more of them without any deforming of the brick itself. And that's what made it possible to build a building as tall as 16 stories with a brick exterior bearing wall. This is a picture that shows the thickness of the wall. You can see the curve of the cornice at the top, but also the projection of the bays. Given that so much space was lost to the ground floor due to the base, it was possible to add projecting bays and steal some of the space back in a way to recapture some of the lost space. Here's a picture of one of the windows on the ground floor, a beautiful hat shop, but for this purpose, you can see the density of the brick, how tiny the brick joints are, but also how thick these walls are. And then moving to the side of the building, you get an idea of the very simple entrance, the shapes of the bricks. You can see the beautiful curve of the wall coming down onto the flat surface of the ground floor, and then the waving of the bays in the upper stories of the buildings. There are something like 37 different brick shapes in this building. But most important place for me is the kind of knife edge corner at the base that gradually changes radius as it moves to the top and eventually joins the beautiful curve of the cornice at the top of the building. This is another place that you have to put your hand on, and then you have to take this picture on your iPhone or your photo device, whatever that may be. But remember what I said about the rookery earlier and the Burnham and Root entrance to that building. Again, in the spirit of repose, simplicity, maybe quietness, Burnham and Root's approach to the entrance to the Monadnock building could not be more simple, could not actually be further reduced. It's about as minimal as it can be. You can tell where the entrance is, but it's certainly not grand by any means. It's just simply an indication that here's where you enter the building, and we mean business. But as you enter the space, this is the corridor that actually goes the entire length of the building with retail spaces opening onto that corridor, so it's an interior mall. Those retail spaces also open out onto the street, and you can see from the light fixtures in this space, the building has been renovated, restored very faithfully to the original, and it's really a treasure of a space. Along the way, you also have this beautiful cast aluminum staircase that goes all the way up through the building. again, restore it to its original idea. But here's the mystery part, because here's where the Halliburton Roche building is added to the Burnham and Root building, and you can see a couple things happen. One is that the exterior wall is not a masonry bearing wall, it's really a steel frame. But you also see at the very top a projecting classical cornice. And it seems that the Brooks brothers maybe thought that Burnham and Root had gone too far stylistically, that maybe we needed to bring some reminder of the past back into our buildings, but they hired Halliburton Roche, and they went back to town, back to work, putting the cornice back up, adding a beautiful arched entrance to the street. On the exterior of the building, you can see the difference. It's sort of a second glance difference. On the interior, you would never notice a difference. And this fun old postcard taken from the south side shows that cornice at the top. And you can see in this postcard, they've sort of fudged a little bit the image of the building to the north, as if to say, yeah, that's there, but we really want to talk to you about this beautiful classical entrance. But as you exit the building at the south on our walk and look up, you've got the great elevated train structure. In 1893, the first stretch of the L was built. It was built in order to make a connection between downtown and the World's Fair, which was about 10 miles south of downtown. People ask, why was it built above ground instead of a subway? I'm not exactly sure I know the reason. One is that the soils are so terrible, and perhaps it would have been technically challenging to hold the soil back, the clay back. The other is that these people were strictly business, and they probably thought, we can crank this thing out quickly if we just put it on the ground and run it straight south to the fair. And that has become now a network of transportation around the city. And to the left of the L, you've got two buildings, the Fisher Building on the left by D.H. Burnham. In the middle, you've got the Harold Washington Library, which is 1991, Hammond, Beebe, and Babka, and then the Old Colony Building by Halliburton Roche. Same firm has designed the second phase of Monadnock to the right. I show this picture just because it's a cool view of the city, and it is a glimpse that you get after you walk out that south end of Monadnock. But I also show it because, as you see in the Harold Washington Library, I used to work for Tom Beebe, and Tom took me to see that joint between the old and new at the Rookery Building when I was a very young architect. And he said, this is a really important thing. I'm sharing that with you now. But then when Tom won the design competition for the Harold Washington Library, that's exactly what he did. He took a lot of details from the Rookery, and at the very top, you can barely make out the place where the masonry wraps around the corner, and then an industrial curtain wall covers the entire remaining part of that alley space. So Fisher is built on the right in 1896, and it's a steel frame on spread footings, on piles, but then the Fisher Building started to lean. It started to tip. And so the taller north end of the building, the one on the left, was built in 1907, and it was built on caissons, and part of its job is not only to enclose office space, but to keep the other Fisher Building from falling down. And I can report to you today, this is where Wheeler Kern's office is. Since 1906, it's still there. It's doing well. This is a hazy image, but it shows basically that the grillage foundations are the very shallow foundations that exist on buildings such as Monadnock. If you want to build taller and you want to build up to as much as 45 stories, you have to go to hardpan, which is roughly 50 feet below grade. And then if you want to build very tall, 50 stories to 100 stories, you have to go all the way down to bedrock, or 95 feet on caissons. So you'll see in Chicago sort of a datum that exists in the 30, 40, 50 story range, and then you see several super tall buildings that exist across the skyline as basically a response to what the soil conditions are. Marquette Building, same developers a block away, same developers as Monadnock. They hire Halliburton Roche, who did the south, more classical part of Monadnock, to design the Marquette Building, and then they added a bay to the west side. Owen Aldous, again, is in charge of this building. They've learned lessons from Monadnock. They want more light and air. They want beautiful yet very small public spaces, and they want flexible plans. So there are three advances in technology that made this building possible. One is that Bessemer had invented the method for fabricating steel inexpensively. That meant that steel, which used to be a semi-precious metal that you could use for surgical instruments, became something which was mass-produced and readily available. And so it was possible to build a building like Marquette using a steel skeleton, to erect it very quickly and to actually have multiple points of support instead of massive walls landing on grillage foundations. The second is the actual glass area. Notice how large the glass panels are in this building. It used to be, in the days of even as early as Monadnock, that glass was very expensive, and that's because glass needs natural gas to be fabricated, and natural gas did not exist in the Midwest or had not been found in the Midwest, and so glass fabrication was very costly until natural gas was discovered in Indiana and Ohio. And so the idea that the glass area could expand, that the frame becomes more visible was another major step forward. And the final and kind of interesting evolution that occurred in this building is the use of terracotta, not just as a fireproofing material to encase structural members, but really as a facade finish, as a curtain wall material. So it does the job of enclosing, not supporting, but enclosing, but it also is a very beautiful ornamental detail. And so here's a picture of that terracotta, especially on the ground floor, and the Chicago window. I'm going to tell you about the Chicago window. There are people from other cities who might debate with me about whether the Chicago window really belongs to Chicago, and I'm just going to say to you here right now, it does. It belongs to Chicago. So if someone says, no, this is a New York window, or this is an Abu Dhabi or a Dubai window, no, it's a Chicago window, and here's what it is. As the glass increased in size, became more of a steel frame, a skeleton frame, there was no artificial ventilation, therefore air had to get in. And so the very large piece of glass in the center, flanked by two operable sashes, became sort of the Chicago commercial window, which we then came to call the Chicago window. Another picture here shows the what's called a guilloche pattern. A guilloche is a French word which basically describes braided or interlaced ribbons, but it's a very beautiful, very heavy, it's like a giant brick piece of masonry, but it is terracotta, it is cast, it does fireproof the building, and it does enclose the building. But here, again, looking up at the cornice of the Marquette building, you can see this wrestling match with style continues, very much like the south part of Monadnock. We've got the projecting cornice, this kind of base middle top expression where the middle isn't a classical proportion, it just goes forever until you get to the point where the top can occur. And then at the entrance to the building, again, compare this entrance to both Monadnock or the Rookery. And here you see, yes, we're going to have columns, we'll have simplified capitals, but we want to make sure that this is more of a familiar expression. So as you go into the building, you'll have a push plate on the door. During the World's Fair, many artisans came to Chicago. They came to show their wares and to win commissions. And one of those artists was a sculptor named Edward Chemis. And I should mention, I passed this building for many years before I ever set foot in the lobby. But it is one of the most gem-like spaces in the city. Here is a picture in the lobby looking down from the mezzanine. And the original light quality was slightly different because the elevators were actually projecting into a courtyard space when the building was built, and they had glass doors so light could filter in from the court space. No longer true. I can't figure out this center column. It's part of the original building. It's a gigantic column, probably supports a structure from the elevator lobby itself. But it's a tiny gem-like space. The Brooks Brothers idea of a very small but beautiful lobby space does not waste a lot of space, but it is very attractive to potential tenants. And you see around the perimeter bronze reliefs. These are of explorers and Native Americans, also done by Edward Chemis. And of course, most importantly, is the beautiful mosaic frieze which moves through the building. And it was designed by J.A. Holzer of the Tiffany Glass and Decorating Company, one of the artisans that was showing their wares at the World's Columbian Exposition. And it does depict the journey of the explorers Marquette and Joliet. It's 94 feet of iridescent glass, semi-precious stones, and mother of pearl. Owen Aldous was a big fan of Marquette. In fact, Owen Aldous translated Marquette's journals from French into English, and so probably why this became called the Marquette Building. This is a scene that depicts the departure of Marquette and Joliet from St. Ignace in 1673, an image of their meeting with the Native Americans along the way, and finally the death of Father Marquette in Ludington, Michigan, on his way home to France. This is on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, directly across from Chicago, and he died in 1675. Here is a picture of Marquette and a picture of Joliet. These are the bas-reliefs that were done by these people, and then finally Black Hawk is shown here. I should mention also that Edward Kemys, if you've been to the Art Institute of Chicago, the two great lions in front of the Art Institute of Chicago, also built in 1893, were done by Edward Kemys as well. So here is Chicago in 1905. The rubble of the Chicago fire has been dumped beyond the railroad tracks, and it's labeled Grant Park. This thing called Grant Park is really just rubble from the fire. It's a good thing they named it a park, so at least they had the idea that this was supposed to be a special place. But the central area is becoming incredibly dense, real estate values are rising, and so is the pressure to build tall. So World War I came along, 4,000 citizens of Cook County lost their lives. The Great Depression came along and shook the entire world. And as we come out of the World War I and the Depression into the next chapter of Chicago, there's a very large change in the entire kind of persona of the city. And so I want to talk about the Field Building, which was completed in 1934 and designed by Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White. What you see in this building, Marshall Field was a developer of the building, the great store magnate, and had this piece of property. Between 1928 and 1930, they had done design work for this building, but the Great Depression hit, and there was all of a sudden a 20% vacancy rate in the city, but they had to make a decision, and they decided to proceed with the building because labor was cheap and materials were cheap. But they had a rule in place, which I don't think you would find too many developers putting in place today, and that rule was that they were only going to take new tenants. They were not going to take tenants away from other buildings because they were already struggling with the vacancy rates that they had at that time. So maybe sort of like a first version of a startup in 1934, 1928. The other thing to mention here, very importantly, is that in 1923, Chicago finally introduced a zoning ordinance. Buildings were getting taller, they were going up to the street edge, and so there was concern over the lack of light and air at the tall parts of the building. And so the zoning ordinance said basically, it's okay to build up to 240 feet at the street, but if you want to build taller than that, you got to set back. And so here you have what ended up becoming what we described as armchair deco architecture. So you would have the two arms of the chair, and the back of the chair would be the back of the building, and there are probably 20 of these buildings in Chicago, all built in the same era, all fully occupying the zoning envelope that was set at that time. But notice the limestone piers, vertical limestone piers with the spandrel panels set back, a huge emphasis on the verticality of the space, no detail, just limestone cranking up into the sky. No cornice, certainly. The whole cornice debate is gone now. We're not going to have a cornice. We may have a top on the building, but we want you to see this building is tall. We don't want you to even think of it as being going any place except limitlessly into space. So where did this Art Deco thing come from? Well, at about the time that Cubism and Futurism and Expressionism were coming into play after the Great World War, there was an exposition in Paris called the International Exposition of Decorative and Industrial Modern Art. 1925, Paris. The war is over. People are looking to the future. They're thinking about Cubism and Futurism and Expressionism, and a lot of exciting things are occurring stylistically. This is a picture of that exposition, and I don't know what this thing is in the foreground. It's a pretty bizarre obelisk, but it certainly is not like anything we've seen before. And then to the left of that, you can see some interesting kind of, I guess you'd say, Art Deco or modern buildings being built. And in the very back, you can see just very faintly the Grand Palais in Paris. So a lot happened in Paris at this time to set in motion a great deal of what happens stylistically in words. So we get the term Art Deco from this exposition, and Art Deco certainly became the style in the 30s in Chicago. So World War I, you also have the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, and the royal tombs of Ur, including King Tut, become available to us for the first time in 1922. And that set off, in addition to Expressionism and the art of Art Deco, you've got this new thing called Egyptomania. People are just crazy about all this new stuff that's been found. Zigzag shapes, pyramids, ziggurats, bas-relief patterns. All those things started to show up in buildings, and you can barely see here, but at the very top of the columns over the entrance, there is a stylized, kind of geometricized wave-like pattern that goes across the top of the building. But as far as actual advances in this building, it's a steel frame, it's a skin, but what they've done here finally is they've introduced air conditioning, which is just such a great idea. However, only on the first 4 floors. So we got air conditioning, but you want to be on the first 4 floors. It also is the first building to have running, drinkable water, which is kind of interesting. I guess before that, they brought in tubs with water. But also they had recessed heating units. So the old radiators that were, sticking out in buildings were now built into the walls. So a couple of pretty interesting advances, all in the interest of attracting tenants. But the movement through the space is great. This was one of my main cut-throughs as a kid working in Chicago at a young age. Beautiful space, Art Deco. The bridge cranking across really reminds me of a ship, maybe an ocean liner ship. Even the reflective surface under that bridge kind of emphasizes movement through the space. And then the metal itself is nickel silver, which is an alloy of copper and nickel and zinc. But the coloration of the space is beautiful. The movement through the space is very exciting. And this is a very large space. So if you think about the Brooks Brothers and the very kind of concern about the size of the public space, here is a case where Field is saying, no, this space is part of the city. We want you to enjoy this space. The clock over on the bridge reminds me of the Cartier tank watch, a beautiful space, a beautiful object. And then the side elevator lobby, you can see above the entrance to the lobby, the book-matched marble. The book-matched marble is a detail that shows up in all of the panels throughout the entire length of the space. This is the letter box. This is where you mail your letters. You can see the kind of stylized, somewhat Egyptian eagle in the center. And then the letterbox itself becomes the elevator annunciator panel. So you can put your letter here, and you can also find out where your elevator is in the building. So, and it is, of course, mimicking the shape of the building itself. And then the use of indirect lighting. You see the fluted columns, the sort of a zigzag pattern. It's not curved, it's angled. And then the beautiful indirect light from this nickel silver light fixture as well. Again, I think all this is coming from this boat. I think it's all coming from the Normandy, which was kind of an incredible thing that was built, designed by the French. The French had an awful lot going on from a design standpoint, but if I could go to one space on any boat, it would be this space. This is the dining room on the Normandy, and notice especially the upside-down light fixture, which is a ziggurat, but it was designed by René Lalique. So you know Lalique, the designs of crystal and glass, incredibly beautiful work. This is another fixture designed by Lalique. And I'm sure that the people that were designing the interior spaces and choosing the fixtures for the Field building were thinking about that when they picked their light fixture for the ceiling. This is a lousy photograph, I apologize. I use this picture to prove to you that I actually took these pictures. Yeah. So there it is. Lalique was the influence on these light fixtures. So finally, in this building, I always ask my tourees, what is this little thing in the corner? And every once in a while, someone gets it right. Does anyone want to guess what it is, except not you guys, because you know? Okay. Who said that? Yeah. You did? Oh, you're out of here. So, yeah, you're right. No one else knew, though. You had to go on the tour. It is a centralized vacuum system. That means that you don't have to have heavy equipment on every floor. You just plug in the pipe and vacuum the floor. And of course, you know the question I asked afterwards, which is, where's all this stuff go? And then when it goes there, what do you do with it? I don't know the answer to that, but I'll tell you next time if I find out. Okay, I need to move along here. Quickly, the Chicago Board of Trade, one of the few streets in Chicago that's terminated by a building. It's just another example of fully occupying the Art Deco, the kind of armchair deco zoning envelope of 1923. And then importantly, at the top of the Board of Trade, you can see, well, first a beautiful clock over the entrance, but also the statue of Ceres. Ceres, goddess of grain, designed by John Bradley Storrs. Chicago, at the time of this building, was the world's largest grain exchange. And this beautiful image, which is at the Art Institute, this beautiful structure model, was actually done after the statue was done because people wanted copies of it. It had gotten some very favorable reviews. This is a view of the interior of that space, reminiscent of the field building, but in some respects much more elaborate, much more rich in terms of its coloration, a very beautiful space. I'm going to come back to that in a couple of minutes. And then a couple things to finish with. The Chicago Federal Center, designed by Mies, was built in two phases. The Dirksen building was constructed across from the other two buildings, and the idea was that you could move people from the existing federal building into that building, tear down the existing building, and then build the other two buildings. And so here's an old drawing that shows the Federal Center located lower right-hand corner, and then you can kind of see, you can definitely see the Monadnock building, so you get an idea of the adjacency. All of these things we're talking about are within this 3-block area. So this is a view of that building before it was torn down, and you can barely make out behind this old Federal Center the field building to the left, and then down to the right you can see the Marquette building. So those buildings coexisted with this behemoth federal building. But Mies van der Rohe came to Chicago in 1938 to be at IIT from the Bauhaus in Dessau. He brought us and invented the international style, which is really characterized by regularity versus symmetry, by volume and masses and universal interior space. And unlike all of the previous buildings I've talked about, this is a building, all of those buildings were symmetrical. All of those buildings had some version of an A-B-A rhythm across the facade. And all of them were basically freestanding objects in the city. But this idea of urban design and construction completely changes the whole thinking about architecture in the city. This I would describe as a peripheral urban composition, which means that the energy from this complex, the buildings of 3 different heights, the relationships between them, almost creating a sensation of spinning off into space, into the city, as opposed to collecting in a centralized and static way, create a dynamic that was never there before. So it's a little bit like like a Mondrian composition. If you think about a Mondrian painting with volumes and lines spinning off into space, and maybe even a rotated grid, this somehow has that same feeling and changes the way you think about what design and space making can be in a city. The Dirksen building that you see reflected on the right side was completed in 1964. And then you can see the foreground building is the post office building, and the background building is the Klosinski office building. These buildings, this is a photograph that I took just to kind of show the interaction of these volumes in space. But I think it also speaks to the elegance, really, of Mies's idea about the skin or the curtain wall. I would say that we think about the evolution of this skeleton and skin. Nobody has come close to duplicating the elegance that Mies accomplished in his work. And I think the problem is that people study it, people look at it, people look at the details, and then they try to do the details. And what's missing is something that Mies had that by the way, I think might be present at Virginia Tech in general. A kind of sense of what it should be, not just an analytic sense, but an expressive and artistic sense. So it's not just a great building, it's Detroit graphite. He figured out that that's the color he wanted to use. So, and then of course we all know the rigid, systematic approach that Mies took. So I'm standing in this picture on a joint in the granite pavement on the plaza. And if I look straight ahead, standing on the plaza, if I look straight ahead, what I see is the fact that it aligns perfectly with the center line of the column across the street in the Dirksen building, because these buildings are on the same system. And I think, okay, that's interesting. But if I look to the right, I see that that line aligns exactly with the mullion on the Klosinski office building. So I'm thinking this is starting to align pretty tightly. But if I turn around and look behind me, there it is, exactly centered on the entrance to the post office building. And it's just a good way to say that one of the things about Mies's success was the combination of artistic inspiration and incredible discipline. Those two things working at such a high level. So, and then of course, the beautiful Calder sculpture. Mies died between the completion of the first phase and the second two phases. And so he never saw the completed Federal Center. And the same thing is true of the Calder sculpture called the Flamingo, which was dedicated in 1974, and to me represents an incredibly successful relationship between a piece of art and its environment. It's as if the sculpture and the building not just reinforce each other, but give each other meaning. I understand and appreciate the grit of Mies's building, partly because of this beautiful curve, and certainly the beauty of Calder is better understood because of what is behind it. So it's a relationship that could not be, I think, more impressive. So Willis Sears Tower, Hancock Center, 1969. Fazler Khan on the far left and Bruce Graham are two people who together designed both the Hancock Center and the Sears Tower, now the Willis Tower. Many of you are working in collaborative studios. Many of you are working with engineers in kind of investigating the way that people will actually cooperate. But in the case of these two people, they didn't just cooperate. It wasn't that Bruce came up with an idea and said, hey, Faz, can you figure out a way to make this thing stand up? You know, pat him on the back. No, they actually thought out the whole idea of the building together. And what's amazing about this, I had the privilege of meeting each of them at different times early in my career. Fazler Khan was the most soft-spoken, sweet, humble, brilliant man that you could imagine, the structural engineer. Bruce Graham, let's just say that every one of those words, he was the opposite. And I really mean that. And they were a perfect partnership in doing this building. And so Sears Tower, in the background, you can see it from the plaza. You see Klosinski on the left, the post office on the right. It was the tallest building in the world for 25 years. I almost moved out of Chicago when Cesar Pelli did Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur because I was so angry that we had lost the title. I thought, what's the point of staying here if we don't have the world's tallest building? But Sears needed space. Richard Daley said he would close Quincy Street because mayors could close streets in those days. And this integrated team of Graham and Kahn developed this idea called the bundle tube. So it's 9 50 by 50 squares. So if you take a pencil and a wooden pencil, use wood, you could break it very easily. But if you took 9 pencils, you absolutely could not break them because they would reinforce each other. So the big force that you have to overcome, yes, we have to go down to bedrock because it's a very tall building, but it's the lateral force. And so Faz Khan's great invention was the bundle tube. That also meant that as you moved up and through the building, you could drop off some of the tubes, create more perimeter space around the building, which is valuable space, and also have smaller tenants. So Sears could move their 5,000 people here. They could inhabit the floors that they need, be all together in one location, and then you could have tenants of different sizes and shapes moving up through the building and pay for the building. What the city didn't quite understand is that when you build a 100-story building and have it come crashing down to the ground in Chicago, which is already known as the Windy City, you've got some definite wind issues. And so when I came to this building as a young architect in Chicago, there were days when I would get out of the cab and there would be pylons with ropes connecting them that I could hold on to get from Wacker Drive to the building without being blown away. It was pretty cool. The other thing that they hadn't anticipated is that there didn't used to be 25,000 people working here. So now here is a city that didn't exist before, and these people need restaurants, they need places to, they need to get there. Maybe they're driving, they have to have places to park their cars. Want to go shopping? There's no shops here. So the city had to kind of grow up and adjust to it. SOM, after they had designed the building, designed an entrance piece in front to prevent me from blowing away when I entered the building. And we learned gradually through maybe mistakes how to deal with that issue. But I'm going to finish now. Got to go back to my friend Ceres. Ceres, there's the statue of Ceres. Ceres in 1988 was being renovated. Ceres, by the way, is 31 feet tall. Ceres is made out of cast aluminum. I mentioned that it was designed by John Storr. I got a call one day from my friend Steve Bing. Steve called, and Steve was a general contractor. He and I worked together. He became a good friend of mine. We worked on a wonderful project together. Steve called one day and said, John, you have to meet me at the Board of Trade tomorrow at 7:30. And I said, why? And he wouldn't tell me. He said, just be there. So I trusted him. So we get to the Board of Trade. We walk into that magnificent space that I just showed you a picture of and get on the elevator and take the elevator to the top floor. We get off the elevator and we go down a hallway and into a room that has 3 beautiful horizontal windows that look straight up LaSalle Street. It used to be an observatory, a place where you could actually see the city when this was one of the tallest buildings in the Midwest. Beautiful view straight up LaSalle Street. And I thought, wow, it was worth coming here. I'm glad that Steve called. Thank you. Now I can go home. And he said, well, that's not really why we came here. I said, well, tell me why. So we walked down the hallway into a back space in the core, and I found myself in a fairly cavernous, happened to be pyramid-shaped space. And he led me over to a corner. He said, by the way, meet me at 7:30, but bring your camera. So I brought my camera. And so he leads me to this point. And as you can tell, I'm starting to get a little bit nervous. My hand is shaking. And this thing to Steve's left is a ship's ladder. You know, it makes you feel safe because it's got that hoop around the back as if, what, you're just going to fall and bang your head on the way down? I don't even know. But there's the ladder. And then if you look up the ladder, you see that it looks like it actually goes out of the building into space. And Steve, by the way, was a technical mountain climber. He had climbed peaks in Nepal, so he was not afraid of any of this stuff. I was getting nervous. So we climbed. It turns out there was a standard kind of pipe and plank and chicken wire scaffold erected around Ceres because they were doing a renovation of Ceres. So Steve said, follow me. We climbed up the scaffold, and it was an experience where I was holding on with one hand and then letting go, and then holding on with that hand and making sure I had that one held before I let go of this one. And then I would take a picture as we kind of went up. These are terrible photographs, but you understand my frame of mind. And then getting up higher, I don't know why I took this picture. I guess you can see the chicken wire at the bottom. That's keeping us from falling, and the wood planks. And then as we get a little bit higher up, there is the back of Ceres' head. Pretty cool. And you can see at an angle, because I was tilted, very faint. You can barely see Lake Michigan in the background, but that gives you an idea of the view from up there looking toward the east. And then leaping ahead of me, Steve Bing made it up to the top, and there he is with a piece of Ceres' crown sticking up, and I took that picture. Notice he has his tie tucked in, just because he's a mountain climber. He knows that you don't want to get tangled up in your tie as you're falling from, 400 feet. So a little bit farther, I took a picture of her face. She doesn't have any facial features. She doesn't need facial features because you're looking at her from 500 feet below on the street. So there is Ceres' face, or what, in beautiful cast aluminum. And those are my feet next to her face. And you can see the wood planks. And then Steve said, okay, take a look from behind. And there is Ceres looking out. I'm looking over Ceres' head, straight up LaSalle Street. And you can see part of the crown has been removed because she is being renovated. And they're working on that piece of the crown. And I said, Steve, it's time for me to go down. I need to go home now. He said, not quite. You've got to do one more thing. You have to get off the plank, and you have to stand on her shoulder so I can take a picture of you. So this is a long time ago. I was younger and maybe not so intelligent then, but this is the last image. That's me standing on Ceres' shoulder in 1988, October of 1988. I remember coming home and telling my wife about this, and she said, John, what if you had fallen? And I think I said something like, you know, as I was up there, I realized I probably only would have fallen about 50 feet. And she said, wait, 50 feet? Yeah. So I wasn't going to make it all the way down to the street. Anyway, my final comment is, and this I hope you take home with you, because it's been 40 years, 45 years for me, and this has been true for me. One of life's great pleasures is to know intimately a great city. This was an inscription that Alice Sinkovich, who was the editor of the first AIA Guide to Chicago, wrote for me. So I hope that you enjoyed the walking tour. If you are coming to Chicago, give me a call. We'll do it in person, now you can actually touch the buildings, and perhaps we'll have more information for you when you get there. So thank you very much.